We are calling this one Young Philosophers. And I'm not going to lie, kids can ask some very interesting questions that leave you absolutely stumped. And I was absolutely stumped about what to drink on this podcast. So I am sipping on some water. I'm going to keep it simple. I can't get too complicated with this one because there are some questions out there that will need your full attention, and your kids will ask them. There will be a point where they ask some very interesting questions. I mean, questions could be things like, why do people die? Or, how was I born? Why do people lie? And just questions that will, you kind of know the answer to, but you don't know the words that it takes to explain them to somebody so young and who might not really even understand what you're about to answer. So I think it can catch a lot of people off guard. It can definitely make you freeze and unsure about how to answer it. But I think the way you approach it might be more important than what you actually say. So I think the pressure is off sometimes with what you actually say to answer these very difficult or shocking questions. But I think it's the approach that you take and your attitude which is more important in these situations. So I think the most important thing is to see this as an opportunity. It is a great opportunity because your kid is inquisitive. They're very curious about whatever question it is, and they're asking you because they trust you. You are their world, especially from a young age. You are one of the most, if not the most important thing to them, and they trust your knowledge. They're trying to learn off you because they want to know what you know. And it's a great opportunity to connect with them and show them that whilst I'm your parent and, sometimes I have to tell you what to do and have to keep you in line, and it's sometimes hard to have a dialogue when these opportunities come up. You can forget all of that for a second and connect with them as another human, as somebody trying to guide somebody else. I think these are the most beautiful, magical moments that you can have with your kid, is explaining things to them, because you start to see the world through their eyes, through their misunderstanding of a certain topic or how things work. And it sort of makes you realize that it's such a fresh slate and you have this opportunity to really help and shape what they believe, what they see, and how to interpret things. So obviously, as kids get older, they have better words to ask questions. So while some of the questions early on might not be the most deep and meaningful, there's also a sense of egocentrism that they lose as they get older, because they start to realize there is other people have feelings too. I think it's like a developmental thing that at younger age, kids are very egocentric. They're all about themselves, what matters to them, and having empathy and realizing that other people have things that matter to them. It doesn't compute as much because they're just dealing with themselves first. But as they get older, they learn these kinds of things and these behavior matters. They will start to imagine the world through other people's eyes. And that's other interesting questions too, because it takes them outside of themselves and makes them sort of wonder about the world in general, even the world that doesn't affect them yet. And I think, sometimes the questions can be like, how big is space? Or like, when will the world end, kind of thing. Questions that you can't possibly answer. That's okay. You don't have to answer. There doesn't have to be a definitive answer to every question they ask. Sometimes you could ask them the question back. Sometimes it's great to get them thinking, and it's kind of like an exercise for them to learn how to think about something maybe they're unfamiliar with, or maybe they have thought about and are trying to learn how to express it. They could say, how big is space? And you could just simply ask back, how big do you think it is? And it sort of gets them flipped over. Instead of waiting for the answer, they'll think about it themselves. And obviously, do you know the answer? I don't know the answer to that. And I don't expect my kid to actually know the answer, but it's just to get them thinking about it, which matters in that kind of situation. I think another very important part to that is what I said before, was it is more important about how you're approaching the question and the conversation than the actual answer itself. I think one of the most important things is to encourage them to have the curiosity and not sort of break them or discourage them, like belittle them or make them feel like the question was silly. There should be no silly questions. They should be able to come to you for anything, right? So we don't want to say, oh, that's a silly question. Why would you ask that kind of thing? It might not really affect them directly in that moment, that's the kind of thing that can really stick with them, even subconsciously. It's kind of like a trust building thing. If they don't think they can trust asking you vulnerable questions or open themselves up in that way, now, what about when they're older? And sometimes these questions can be big, and you're helping shape them. You're helping maybe to think of things in a certain way that they might not be able to think of without your guidance. So whilst, we don't know the answer sometimes, maybe the process of trying to figure it out together is something that is more important than knowing what the answer is. So we don't want to shut down a discussion. I think in our busy day-to-day lives, it can be hard to, on the spot, answer what is life to a kid or something, something abstract. But I think being able to go through the exercise of figuring it out together not only helps them build their problem-solving skills or deal with abstract issues or think of things in a different way, but you're building trust and helping them to think for themselves is probably the main point of everything that you're doing right now. And of course, sometimes curiosity can come from things they've thought about themselves, but also probably from things that arise in the playground or at school, or, something will happen to somebody and your kid will ask why. Maybe a family member passes away and your kid will ask you, what happens when you die? Why did they die? What happens after, kind of thing. And obviously, if that's a family member that's passed, it can be a really tough time to go through that conversation. But I think if you were to shut your kids out at that moment, it sort of belittles them and maybe makes them think those questions aren't important, or they're not worth answering, or they're not worth thinking about. And I don't think that's true. I know things can be rough around that sort of subject, but you still want to help them. And, maybe if they do observe there's pain around when somebody dies, or maybe they're feeling it themselves, but they don't know how to express it, asking about that subject is a way of them dealing with grief or dealing with a hard time for themselves. So whilst it can be maybe easier to shut it down and just say, I don't want to talk about it, maybe working through those things will do more benefit than harm. My kid recently asked the question of how babies are made, and my wife was extremely forward and logical about everything. Like, there was no sugarcoating well, it comes from the Cabbage Patch, or, when we make a wish and then a baby appears, or something like that. And maybe that has its place somewhere. I'm not sure. But we always had that idea that we would have that discussion honestly, and answering the tough questions, maybe tough questions, with actual answers. Give them something they can use. Because I think if you're giving them BS answers, eventually it'll catch up. And it's topics like sex and reproduction and uncomfortable things like that, they're going to come up. They're going to learn those things eventually. So, wife feels like, why not learn it from us? Which is exactly true, and which is why I agree with it. But it was very cute to hear the explanation about, a men's body and a woman's body, and what's the difference between them and, say, her body, and that this is what happens. And then, that's how a kid becomes a baby. And whilst, okay, they might not actually understand all the details, and it sounds wild and weird. I mean, it sounds wild and weird anyway, but it's normal, and it's their curiosity, and we're kind of feeding it now. So if they want to learn more, if they want to ask questions more about it, we're happy to discuss it. I personally can't remember having the talk with my parents, but I'm not sure I even asked. So I think, if your kid is confident enough to ask, you don't want to shut it down. You want to let them know that it's okay, and to ask you those questions. Obviously, a lot of the answers that we've given, we've maybe had to repeat at different ages. So maybe if they ask where kids come from when they're like 3 or 4 years old, the answer obviously doesn't go into as much detail or depth that at 8 years old that we would give. Obviously, sometimes the answer needs to be simple or tailored to whatever age, maturity they are, and all that. But I think it's a great time to help them understand the world, how the world works sometimes. Like the amount of patience I realize I have explaining things to them, to my kids, amazes me sometimes. Because even, say, we're driving somewhere and someone will cut me off, and they'll see I'm upset. They'll see me. I try not to swear in front of them, but they'll see me. Maybe I'll beat my horn. Maybe I'll be like, oh, this guy. And I don't swear in front of them. I don't like to swear in front of them. And they'll ask, now they're asking, why did you beep? Why did that guy do that? Why did you get upset? And even in a moment where I'm maybe upset at the world, there's just this clarity that comes with explaining to somebody who doesn't understand what just happened. It's almost therapeutic for myself as well. And it can help you realize stuff about yourself when you're explaining it, why you're behaving a certain way to your kid. But it also helps them to understand that the world isn't perfect, and there are things that we don't understand. There are many things that we can't control, even as their parents. They think we've got it all together, or that we know everything in the world, or we can control everything around. But as they get older, they realize, we can't control the way other people move in the world around us. And it's sort of the bigger questions will start to come out, like morality, like why do people fight? Why do people push other people? Why do people lie and steal? And it, even when you put that question back to them, or you'll ask them a question like, would you steal if you were hungry? Or like, would you take someone's money if they left it on the ground? And sometimes the philosopher can be turned around. Sometimes our kids don't have to be the philosopher asking questions. We can ask it of them and get them to think. And I would encourage trying to ask your kids hypothetical questions about how they would react or behave in a certain ways, because they do learn maybe what is right, what is wrong. But also there's some gray areas there. Would you call the police if you saw me dropping rubbish on the ground? Dropping rubbish on the ground is wrong. We say, oh, that person should get in trouble if they drop rubbish. What happens if you see mum or dad dropping rubbish? Do you call the police? And not because we're trying to teach them to cover up criminal activity or anything like that. I think it's just more figuring out how they think about things and what makes them decipher what's important and what matters and what doesn't matter. I think it's a really interesting thing to do as well. I can't encourage enough to try and ask your kids questions, hypothetical questions like that. That's so much fun to me. I love doing that kind of stuff. I think that comes from my parents doing it to me too. I'm just thinking now, some of the questions that I would get asked when I was a kid, it's maybe almost traumatic. It's kind of like, if mum died, would you want me to marry this other like family friend? Would you like her to be your mum, or do you like your mum? Kind of thing. You think about it now, it's kind of crazy, but it kind of gets you as a kid thinking, oh, I don't want that to happen. No, I don't want her. I want my mum, and I don't want things to happen. But it's an exercise, I guess, and it can lead to some very interesting answers too. So we'll call it there for the philosophers, I think. If you have any questions or you want to get involved, like I said, comment in any of the episodes on any platform. I'll see it. Let me know in the description through any of my socials, anything you want to say. I would love to get in touch and connect with anyone who wants to get involved. My name is Wingers. Thank you for making it this far. If you're listening to this right now, I appreciate you, and I'll see you next week.